Hi, this is John, and we're going to be looking at how to write scientific papers, just a few basics of what things are going. Now, for this one, what I've done is I've pulled up one of the papers from my doctoral research, and we're going to look over a couple of the key parts, a couple of the styles for writing. Now, I'm actually going to skip a few of those parts. That's going to be covered in the reading scientific papers, so just kind of, notice what I'm going to skip. Now, once again, of course, you've got a title, the authors, abstract. Once again, I'll cover that in the other video. Now, let's look at the writing style. And scientific papers are generally broken into three kind of core parts, and then you've got some other parts that are sticking onto them. The first part is the introduction that I'm going to talk about. The introduction sets the stage for the paper, and depending on the paper, may vary in size. Sometimes as short as a paragraph, and other times it may actually be most of the paper. This is trying to get the reader to understand the context. And generally speaking, introductions will be fairly broad to start with, trying to get the reader to understand why they should care, and the basics of what's going on. Whereas later on in the introduction, as I will stop by towards the end of the introduction, it gets fairly specific, trying to justify why what was done, why this seems like it's going to be a good idea. Once again, this is actually a persuasive paper. But when looking at this introduction, let's look at a few of the styles. Feel free to pause the video on YouTube, that is the K key, and we'll take a gander at the intro. Okay, first off, what you should find is, notice all of these numbers. These are citations. Every journal has their own style of citation. Rarely do we actually use MLA. Some of them use fairly close cousins. Obviously, this is definitely not. These are numbers. Each one of these references a citation in the reference section, which is at the back end of the paper. Now, you'll notice that this introduction is fairly heavily cited, and that's fairly standard. The introduction is giving a general broad view of what's going on. The author's weight of authority isn't taken into account. You want to cite your sources, not just your opinions. And really, there is no room for opinions in a scientific paper per se. Obviously, you come up with your conclusions, and those are, in effect, an opinion about the evidence, but you do have evidence to back that up. So, we have a lot of citations. Additionally, you'll notice that there's a complete lack of quotes. There's actually very rarely quotations in scientific papers. I have probably only seen 2 or 3 in my life, and those usually are calling someone out, and is a fairly aggressive thing to do. So, when writing, don't use quotes at all. Paraphrase everything that needs to be paraphrased. Odds are you're going to be condensing an entire paper into a sentence or less, as you can see with a few of these. Now, moving on to the introduction, as you go lower in the introduction, you get more specific. So you now have talk about the particular tools that I'm going to be using. And you'll notice the number of citations have actually managed to increase. Not in the beginning, I was doing 1 citation per sentence. Now, all of a sudden, I have a sentence right here that, if you look at it, has 6 citations in it. So we've gone pretty heavy on the citations. Again, you're supporting everything you say with evidence, and in the introduction, your evidence is your citations. Now, as I'm going down, I'm going to notice a couple other things. I have a figure here. Pictures are helpful. They should never actually be required because, you could have visually impaired readers, or for whatever reasons, people who cannot see the pictures. But they are useful. So in this case, I have the structure of the main chemical of interest for this paper, EGCG, or epigallocatechin gallate. Structures or pictures in general, whether they be a structure, an actual picture, a graph, a chart, something like that, are labeled figures. So in this particular style, we put fig and then a number. That way, in the text, I can say, see figure 1. You'll also notice that they are captioned enough that you can understand what on earth that picture is without actually finding it in the text. So I can look at it like, ooh, cool photo, or cool photograph, and get to see what it is. Now, as I scroll down, I'm going to enter the second part of my paper, the second major part, and that's the materials and methods. The core part of the scientific method is being able to show that, hey, here's what I did, you can reproduce it. So I need to give you enough information to do reproducibility. Typically, you're going to see right up at the front of these materials and methods a quick, hey, here's where we got the chemicals, and it is definitely a good idea to list Once again, if your materials and methods is a long section in a paragraph, or if it's simply a large paragraph because you have a fairly straightforward experiment, a sentence saying where you obtained your chemicals. Now, the rest of the materials and methods are a series of paragraphs, usually, each describing one of the experiments that I did in this paper. Now, once again, a scientific paper usually has a lot of experiments in it. If you're writing a lab report, you may only have 1 or 2 experiments, so you're looking at a much smaller materials and methods. A couple key things to consider. 1, some paragraphs are heavily cited. These are ones where I simply used an experiment somebody else did. There is no point reinventing the wheel. If it worked for them, it should work for me. And so I simply used their method, and thus I have to give them credit, / allow you to go look at what they had done by citing it. Second, you'll notice that this is written in a rather stylized form. I'm telling you what was done. I have not used the word I in the entire paper, nor we or any other reference to myself. It's usually excluded for a couple of very specific parts of the paper. The emphasis is going to be on the chemicals, not on the person. You'll also notice that this is not a how-to book. This is not written as do this, do that. It is entirely in third-person passive. This is what was done. Okay, a couple other key points. Here I have an acronym that I'm going to be using. LOD, limit of detection. And I've made sure to spell that out so that the reader knows, hey, this is what that means. So if you're going to use an acronym that's not relatively common, the first time it gets used in your paper, you need to spell it out and tell the reader what it is. Now, you will notice that this section of the materials and methods is pretty much citation free. This is an area where I had done the work. This is not somebody else's method. This is the one that I had developed. So I have, in excruciatingly detail, told you how I did what I did. Enough that presumably you could be able to set up the instruments and run them exactly as I did and hopefully get the same results. Because if you don't get the same results, then we got a problem. Okay, moving down, I'm going to go into the last part, or the last major part of my paper, and that's the results and discussion. Once again, for a fair amount of work, and this paper is representing a couple of years of my life, this is going to be a fairly long section. For a single lab, this may only be a paragraph. Now, in this part, once again, I'm talking about what is taking place. This area may be divided into 2 sections depending on the publisher that you're trying to publish with. That said, what I'm doing here is telling you what I found and trying to provide context and meaning and understanding for that. Once again, you'll notice the citations have come back. This should have a bit of a tick-tock feel where I say, okay, I found this, and this relates to these people's work, and then, hey, that means probably this. Now, once again, you see more figures, and in cases, you'll notice how I'm referencing them in the text. The text contains enough information that I don't need to figure, but it is definitely nice. Now, as I scroll down, I get a bit more text and more figures. Now, this figure is a bit more complicated, and its caption is significantly longer. It's explaining the parts of that figure, enough that I don't need to read the paper to understand the figure, and I don't actually need to see the picture to understand the paper. Once again, more citations as we go. This introduces the one table that I have in this particular paper. Now, notice tables are labeled tables and table 1. They are not figures. These are text. Tables are written above the table where figures are written below, both of which contain sufficiently detailed descriptions to explain what's going on, and once again, any abbreviations, I'm explaining what they are. These are also fairly gussied up tables. You want it to look nice and presentable. You'll also notice that everything's in black and white. It's quite common to print these off, so when color is not needed, generally we don't use it. That said, there are many papers in which color is essential for the understanding of what's taking place, and those are, of course, in color. Continuing to scroll down, we have left the major part of the paper, ending with the conclusions. Once again, for a larger work, this may be a paragraph. For shorter works, this may actually be as little as a sentence. So in the conclusions, I have conclusions, and then it continues on to the end. A short acknowledgement, basically, thank you for giving us money and for helping us, and then the references. You'll notice that there are actually quite a few references, and these all appear somewhere in the text. You don't simply slap down a reference that hasn't been appeared in the text previously, and of course, You make sure you cite your sources. This, of course, is the bulk of the paper. Above the paper, at the start, is the abstract, and at this part, this is the too long didn't read of the paper. This is a summary of what the paper is about and what the findings were. The idea here is that publishers will quite often only provide for free abstracts, and with the abstract, the reader can then choose if they wish to purchase the entire paper. Thankfully, many papers are now no longer behind paywalls, although there are still quite a few aforementioned paywalls, and you might have to pay for your paper. That said, if you're at a school, it's usually not such a big deal. Okay, that's the basics of scientific writing. The key things that usually throw most people: the lack of use of the word I, we, us, etc., and of course the lack of quotes. So with that said, enjoy writing and have a wonderful day.